Yeah, so I'm Pascal Michael, hello, first year PhD student at Greenwich University with Dr. David Luke, and my PhD is sort of generally a predominant strand of it is a comparative phenomenological analysis between the DMT and near-death experience. So hands up, kind of who's got a relatively good grip on what near-death experience is. Alright, cool, yeah, cool. So, you know, light at the end of the tunnel kind of stuff. But it's a syndrome of usually quite profound experiences, not necessarily at the time of death, so a bit of a misnomer in that sense, but sometimes when you are temporarily clinically dead, or you're in a critical state, or you're under physical distress, sometimes even when you just believe you might die. So yeah, I'll also be conducting a qualitative study on the near-death experience as well next year, as well as some kind of pharmacological and EEG measures thrown in there for good measure as well. To determine really in what way and to what extent might DMT stimulate or in fact underpin which different dimensions of the near-death experience. So I'll be presenting today where I've got to so far with the qualitative analysis of the DMT experience from the DMT field study with Dr. David Luke and myself and colleagues. So yes, these are some kind of major phenomenological cartographic publications on DMT. So we got Stephen Szara in the 50s, very first to, at least under scientific auspices, self-administer DMT and sort of discover it as a novel psychotogenic agent. Strassman, of course, now classically in the 90s, he said that at least half of his higher dose recruits had this kind of this sort of reception by a panoply of beings, this kind of transmigration to a seeming other space. And Cott Rock here, the only other thematic analysis done so far, but they were just using kind of singular narratives, and some of the accounts were from many years ago, and in my opinion, quite coarse, crude analysis. And of course, Chris Timmerman, last year at Imperial University, publishing DMT models, the near-death experience, and that was a quantitative study. And so they used the near-death experience questionnaire. While my project will hopefully kind of be helping elaborate on that with a qualitative kind of richness. And they all kind of found, in essence, the same stuff, but increasing depth and detail, so disembodiment, these kind of mystical type components of reconfiguration or transcendence in self, time, and space. And but what makes DMT quite unique, but it's not to say that it doesn't happen with other psychedelics, but maybe it's just more replicable and reproducible with DMT, is this sort of this profound hallucination toward this immersive other space and this reception by the presences or beings. And of course, near-death experience phenomena, which is what I'm particularly interested in. So what is the field study? It's an observational study. All previous work has been in lab settings, and that's interesting in terms of the centrality of set and setting and how those lab settings might influence experiences. So instead, we rock up to recruited DMT users' homes as they're planning to have their DMT experience, on invitation, of course, and when they're having their DMT breakthrough experience, and we measure out their DMT supply, which averaged at about 55 milligrams. And so that's approximately 30-35 milligrams intravenously, and prior lab studies, for instance, Chris Timmerman's for maximum of 21 milligrams intravenous, Strassman's was 28, I believe. The picture of our subjects, so they're all healthy, majority were these seasoned DMT psychonauts, and so that was inclusion criteria really. They were mostly male and European, but covering kind of reasonable age span. But the primary kind of important novel features of the study is that it's a discrete data set, so that's versus, you know, looking at heroin, of course, for instance, which are triaged, cherry-picked, essentially. We carried out a semi-structured interview, so that's versus it just being a narrative, and this was moments after the trip, so that's versus it just being retrospective, mitigating a vast amount of forgetting. So in all, the collection of data was like alive. And we also used the micro-phenomenological technique in the interview, so that's kind of meaning we rehearsed the whole experience with the participant, different domains in the body, emotionally, sort of, these of course entity and other world encounters, and using intensity ratings as sort of time markers throughout. So there are 23 sort of interviews usable sort of as yet, and I've coded 19 of these into my analysis, and that's I'm counting. That's from 15 participants, so some of them sort of came in for some repeated doses with us. And I incorporate two a kind of parallel quantitative dimension, so tallying in how many interviews were particular experiences featured. But ultimately, I'm applying a thematic analysis to all the reports, and so now I'm actually just going to focus on a small subset of those themes. So three major overarching categories which undoubtedly emerged were the encounters with other beings, and that was 18 out of our 19 sessions, and of course exploring other worlds, and that was experienced in 17 out of our 19 interviews. And so death and near-death experience, type experiences also certainly emerged. So these components I mentioned before, they certainly reared their heads once again in the study. But right off the bat, there's an important kind of discovery, and that virtually all of our psychonauts, they had entity encounters. And Strassman said approximately half of his 28 milligram recruits did, though ours did average around 55 milligrams, so that would be slightly higher, so it might make sense in that sense, but very interesting. So today we're just going to delve into some sub-themes of the encounter category. So that's the role or function that these entities sort of assumed, the form that they take, their demeanour, so that's kind of the character and their sort of attitude and intentions. In attempts to kind of formulate a bestiarum vocabularium, as John Hanna really nicely puts it. This is a DMT and entities symposium after all. However, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to reflect in parallel and throughout on how the experiences echo previous published DMT reports. And in doing so, there'll be further sort of detailing of the other space they're immersed in, and kind of objective constitutes, etc., where we'll get into some pretty high weirdness, in my opinion. And we'll get into the near-death experience type phenomenology, and at that point becoming a bit more theoretical, and the implications of that, as that's very relevant for my PhD. So it was evident that the being served a host of these different functions determined by the kind of interactions.
What was the NDE death birth instance?
Well, near-death experience.
Yeah, but what was the
The incidence. Oh, that's a very interesting question. Maybe we can talk about that with the Q&A. So yeah, those roles which were actually the most frequent were showing something to the experiencer, so that's 9 out of our 19, and you kind of see the quantitative bit in the second column here, in descending order. And also attempting to teach or explain something, and also acting as a guide or helper. And so this report is from Humphrey Earwicker, one of our participants. That's a good example of a form of teaching which transpired in the encounter. When you see these kind of orange scrolls, I'm not actually going to read them out, but I'll put in bold the sort of juicy bits for you to kind of scan over, right? So here we've got a sketch of something he saw as well, which he christened the initiation machine. Well, only 1 out of our 19 interviews, we had quite a classic trickster-esque encounter from John MacDonald, and that's kind of related to that Joker archetype. So he says the following: a feeling of being pointed to, look over there, but you know you shouldn't, like a trick. Distraction is a big part of the experience. Hints at, look the other way, and then laughing, but you kind of don't look. Bit of menace, not a lot of malice, done on a fun and whimsical level. A lot of hints at death, but in a comical way. I think I might have seen my mum, which is weird. She's dead, you know. But in a comical way, there's a lot of comic stuff in there. Everything was very questionable, teasy but not mean. Definite sort of laughter going on, hints at skulls being laughed at, a definite dismissal of death, so that's a communication. So this kind of combined sense of being deceived, the whole trip's a kind of major look gag, and it's sort of combined with this jokey mischievousness and a silliness, but a truly breaking of convention in terms of, which is quite the quintessence of trickster territory, with this palpable sense of like laughing in the face of death. But this also has a lot of parallels to other DMT reports in the literature. So for instance, we've got Gallimore, for instance, describing aeroid reports, following They were laughing themselves silly, rolling across the ceiling, layer after layer of giggling beings. The hilarious creatures vied for my attention. So momentarily just moving away from the role theme just for now, John MacDonald also describes the kind of scene which he found himself in, and he says the following: all this disorganized space that you can't quantify in 3D space, it's not necessarily linear, everything made sense where it was, even though it wouldn't make sense in a normal situation, and a lot of mechanical imagery, and that's not new. Lots of snake imagery, the way things are moving in coils, lots of wheels, cog-like representations, things spinning, everything's going into itself and coming out of itself, everything's constantly moving, a cyclic nature to the movement. So, echoing this again, one of Strassman's subjects in his original studies reported the following: rounded tubes, machine-type things, like fibre optic lamps. There was a machine in the centre with round conduits, almost writhing, more like a snake, more in a technical manner. Again from Gallimore, and I think peculiarly encapsulating all of these kind of major themes of a gyrating machinoid imagery, nonsensical space, and these avidly attention-directing beings. He says, a wacky toy factory, gadgets, widgets, twirling machines, and stair-step pattern Escher-like space. The beings would seem to go, look! And I felt like I was supposed to look. What did the beings actually look like? A smorgasbord of different things. There's a veritable phonic taxonomy we have. So we sort of met John's tricksters. They're essentially, as he put it, quote, areas with personality, abstract paintings. Couldn't see if it had a big head or a big ass. But humanoid, and also, which means like us, which is very interesting in its own right. But self-transforming as well, with the most reported physical qualities in both of them, 5 out of 19 interviews. But self-transforming here being without, being minus the Mechanian machine elf suffix. So we didn't actually get any elves in the kind of visual sense of the kind of little people. But here, just the visual quality of having that fluxy mercurial character. Here, one of our participants, Terence McKenna, describes an example of this. Not the Terence McKenna, kind of beyond the grave, back on the pipe to do some DMT for science, but no, we asked our participants to assign themselves pseudonyms. This guy was clearly a very big fan. I'm sure that the McKenna would be very proud of him. But he shall heretofore be referred to just as Terence, so remember that. A couple of experiences where the closest analogy to what the beings look like was octopussy, not to be confused with the James Bond film, obviously. So that was 2 out of 19 sessions, and Terence here experienced that, but he additionally qualifies them to look sort of snake-like. So he says the following: if I need to compare with something on this planet, they're like octopus from another planet. Long head, scalp here was big. It's far from octopus, but that's the closest. He also says, I can see very strange hair, very thin, long snakes, kind of snakes, the movements. In this case, his octopussy entities also have this clinical way about them. So, doctopuses, in a sense. Like Dog Hulk, if you're into Spidey at all, interestingly. So he says, something on their face like doctors had, a medical mask, preparing something like for surgery. There were doctors preparing their tools. They were studying somehow at me. Again, just deviating from appearance as such, he goes on to elaborate his trip as the following. They were very good, very calm, trying to calm me, to show me. I was inside of a lab, a lot of lights. My body was paralysed somehow. I was lying on my back. They were trying to keep me focused on that liquid laptop or something, I don't know, tablet? It was like an iPad, but it was liquid. Trying to convince me to pay attention when I was looking inside, preparing something like tools to show me another liquid tablet. So, I don't know what this liquid iPad's all about. It might be one from the future, kind of taking liquid crystal screen to the next level maybe. I think the iPuddle might be a good marketing strategy. You can see here exactly that. This is a sketch that he made, really beautiful image, I think, of these octo-serpentine lab techies with their masks and their sort of snakeoid protrusions. and of course the eye puddle. But this, I thought, it bear a lot of comparison to other DMT phenomenology, such as Strassman and Fractal 2008. They say, one of their participants, there was a female who reassured me, and she was showing something. The quote was, yeah, female who reassured me, something green appeared in front of me, rotating, doing things. She was showing me how to use this thing, which resembled a computer terminal. And Strassman 2001 saying, one of his participants, quote, 4 distinct beings looking down like I was on an operating table. They'd done something and were observing the results. Another subject, I was in an alien lab in a hospital bed. Their sense of purpose was alien. They had a space ready for me. So they're both reassuring entities showing some bizarre device in alien lab type setup. The demeanour of these entities connoting the kind of character of these characters. So we've looked at John's trickster-esque encounters, of a mischievous, jestful kind of nature. But the majority of our entity encounters were benign or benevolent, so in accumulations of 10 out of our 19 experiences. None were strictly negative, but one experience encounter with a multi-eyed entity was pretty fear-inducing, so we'll sort of go over both. So the sort of fearsome encounter is the following. So this is RH's account. He says, it was disturbing, definitely the dying bit. Uncountable, crazy number of eyes. Scary, really scary. Where am I? What am I? What's going on? This doesn't feel right. It was a conscious being which was red and had lots of eyes. Scared me a lot. I had that trapped feeling like a room. I heard people talking about a waiting room. I suspect that's what they're talking about. A space that doesn't make sense. Jesus and the terror. It's more to do with the fact that reality is so broken it's gone. I knew I was between worlds. And he made a rough sketch as to this kind of fearful ophthalmic fiend here. Kind of says on it, oval covered in eyes, scary, surrounded by darkness. And in David Luke's paper, Disembodied Eyes Revisited, he states one of his own experiences with DMT, expressing the following. Swirling, smiling eyeballs, all attached to snake bodies. I mean, this thing really scared me. It acted with utter surprise and alarmed. The ominous numinous proceeded to let me know I should not be there. And then he goes on to say, before his encounter, in a dream once, I had a mind-blowing encounter with Azrael, the Islamic angel of death. The angel told me its name. Azrael is considered to have 10,000 eyes, and is the holy psychophon who ushers souls into the realm of the dead. So thus in both we see beings associated with death and the experience of dying, plastered in eyes where the experiences do not belong, instilling a sense of deep, ominous animosity. But the beings, in most of our cases, like I said, gave the impression that they've really got your back, at least of your astral body. So another experience articulated also, quote, they seemed every bit as curious as I was. So curiosity being the next commonest, that's 3 out of our 19 cases. So Master Platt, another subject of ours, has both of these demeanors in his encounter. He says the following. There were various observers, a sense of being healed, a sense of them working on my physical and psychic body. Very benevolent, some curiosity from their perspective, looking out for me, also wanting to get something out of interaction. They were curious to understand what I am. He also goes on to elaborate on his trip, saying the following, super holographic, digital looking, multi-dimensional space of hieroglyphic language I see every time. The whole trip was in a playpen, but underneath some sort of moth-like thing, holding the space and created the playpen. More a multi-dimensional moth, lying over me. I was in some sort of moth scanner, sense of body scan going through my body physically and mentally. They got my energy, and they were interested in the pollutants. Maybe it was some kind of fuel they could use. Later in his trip he says, half dome, like a satellite, like a black hole that has structure, an infinite black space within it. And in this again, I saw multiple resonances from other published reports. So for instance, one from Strassman's original participants, he says the following, It was Mayan hieroglyphics. The hieroglyphics turned into a room like I was a child. There were toys. An alien type insectoid side of this. It's like a hologram, a whole body effect. And the same subject, but just a different dose. There was an insect-like thing hovering over me. Then I was yanked, sucked into outer space, a black sky with a million stars. So, once again, quite striking concurrent constellation of these themes between Master Platt here and my Strassman subjects, even kind of in terms of the sequence in which it happened. And finally, the near-death experience. So, phenomenologically, we know Strassman famously posited that endogenous DMT is kind of like the reality thermostat upon which our soul might piggyback into the after realms. Recently, Imperial published DMT models the near-death experience, but crucially now, we know in terms of biological association between DMT and near-death experiences. Dean and colleagues just last month quite mind-blowingly published that endogenous DMT rises significantly after cardiac arrest induction in the mammalian, in this case rat, brain. But generally, there was quite scant emergence of typical NDE themes which I coded, but all of which do occur are still quite psychedelicized or DMT-ified more aptly. So this perhaps is one of my favourite quotes. I think is powerfully suggestive of this. This is Alan Watts describing his very first DMT experience as being fired out the muzzle of an atomic cannon with neon Byzantine barreling. So ultimately it's actually reporting the tunnel experience of intrinsic to NDEs in a way, but it has this breakthrough type, explosive, hyper-colourful, perhaps hieroglyphic superimposition on top. Szara, so I mentioned Stephen Szara's study in the 50s at the start. So his very first experiment with DMT, they actually ranked the classes of experiences which emerged, and NDEs come at the bottom of the chart. So it is actually very important that from the very first experimental study with DMT, these themes of death and dying ranked at all. But they were comparatively less frequent. However, more typical NDE type features can occur with DMT, of course, and a good example is from this very first study from Szara as the following. I hear a whistling, and the whistling noise is quite common for out-of-body experience at the start of near-death experiences. I am en route somewhere, but where? This is death. I have arrived. In front of me are two quiet, sunlit gods, and this idea of being of light is very fundamental to near-death, lots of near-death experiences too. They are welcoming me into this new world. So we did similarly have a few scenarios closely mirroring more traditional NDE literature. So 3 cases describe something akin to the light, quite quintessential to near-death experience. Every book on near-death experience has the word light in it somewhere. So Luke here describes it particularly well. Spam, another subject, also encompasses a kind of nice dying-like sensation, but also a flashing of his life before him, and a projection of himself into the perspective of others. And he was the only one to describe both, and that's interesting because they do usually co-occur in classic near-death experiences. Ulrich as well, in both of his trips, reporting a classic experience of the void, which I described sort of earlier, kind of a subset of the distressing NDE category. However, most of the NDE-related experiences that were brought up did have this kind of DMT filter turned on, such as John McDonald saying, "My mum popped up, which was weird. She's dead, you know, but she was in a frame. Bit like a magic mirror, like Snow White or whatever." There was a kind of impression of, "Oh, don't worry about that, that's not your concern." So John's deceased mother actually emerged out of a kind of mirror on the wall, and there were those tricksters communicating this joviality in the light of death. Also the following from Luke. This person opened up, had his hand on this portal, this bit in my mind. He opened it up and went further and further, and I was flying through these dimensions. There were many portals, I was flying through them. So no classic tunnel experience per se, but there were these multitude of portals unlocked by some kind of interdimensional butler. And I'm going to end on RH's trip here. Might be one of my favourite encounters. I know, to be scientifically objective, I probably shouldn't have favourites, but just because it had a host of qualities shared by the classic beam of light met during many NDEs. And importantly, he had this directly prior to that voyage type experience of dying that I mentioned. So he says the following: extraordinarily beautiful. I don't know if I cried, but the intensity of it was amazing. We definitely knew each other. Without any question, extraordinary intelligence, beyond anything I can imagine, really. The most profound sense of love. I know it's incredibly beautiful, and I'm familiar with it. If you told me this entity was made of 1,000 beings, I'd believe you. However, he also likens the actual appearance of this entity as the following: tentacles! It's either like my imagining of what synapses look like, synaptic nerves, or something a bit octopusy. Certainly had quite a lot of things reaching out all over the place. So again, you might experience the essence of the archetypal light being, but they might appear more like some kind of hyperspatial supersentient synapse. And this is a kind of quick sketch which he drew of that here. You can obviously get the impression of kind of tendricular protrusions coming out in kind of synaptic way. So just to kind of close up, strengths and novelties of the DMT field study, it was prospective, so meaning we were able to interview experiences right after their trip, so we extracted a much finer degree of phenomenological richness, and it kind of constituted a mixed methods content analysis as well. I focused specifically on the entity encounter, really, the sense-presence effect, touching on the immersive DMT scape as well, but also describing a kind of way to look at the relationship between the DMT and the near-death experience. So those characteristic effects of DMT haven't gone anywhere, kind of further consolidated them, and they're continuing to be delineated in the analysis. I also hope I've convinced some of you about the kind of frankly bizarre resonances between experiences from our psychonauts and those already extant in the kind of DMT-osphere. Dalmore and David Luke again in a research article called DMT Research from 1956 to the End of Time, similarly kind of chronicle kind of usual suspects throughout documentation of DMT phenomenology. But why is the ultimate question? Has the DMT meme become so ubiquitous? Has the Strassman effect taken grip so pervasively? We can't obviously know the status of naivety or knowledge of all of our subjects about all of the themes, but I think it's quite interesting and incidental that RH, who had that kind of scary multi-eyed death entity, if you remember, he was apparently fully unaware of David's publication and the concept of this mythological being itself. But I think the degree of similarity, even in terms of the chronological sequence, should provoke consideration of such explanatory mechanisms such as collective unconscious or the related morphic resonance, if you're familiar with Rupert Sheldrake's hypotheses, and that would also account for the deep sense of familiarity. So just last thing, so while my research is still in its nascent stages, I'm going to be running the same qualitative analysis next year with near-death experiences specifically. But for now, I think it's useful to think in terms of, one, how much you get on DMT. So DMT is prodigiously contentful, and not least of archetypal imagery. So that of death, maybe the ultimate symbol of life, might be expected. Two, what you get on DMT. McKenna would obviously say elves, everybody does. But obviously we found that there's a content cornucopia with DMT, really much more than elves. But while you're much less likely to get, as we identified by our use of the near-death experience questionnaire, seeing dead loved ones, having a life review, or seeing a border of no return. And that obviously might be influenced by setting differences. But crucially, last sentence, how do you get it? So really, DMT and near-death experiences share a common template. So for instance, Chris Tillman stresses the word models. So DMT models the near-death experience. So DMT is unique in that it fulfills the functions, so kind of templates of the NDE. So the generic most kind of being other worlds and other beings, and the contents have got this DMT lens applied to it. So for the immersive space, you might see a lab. Off the encounter, you might get clowns, but as opposed to near-death experiences, which will more likely land you with rolling hills and an audience with Christ. Thank you.